Okay, let's unpack this. We've all heard those historical stories, right? Figures celebrated, really revered for dying for their faith.
Absolutely. Standing firm against all odds. It's a powerful narrative.
But what happens when that narrative gets, well, completely flipped?
Yeah.
What if figures we think of as martyrs are seen by some as, well, something very different?
That's exactly the kind of provocative challenge we're digging into today. We're looking at the story of the Uganda Martyrs, but through a really radical alternative lens.
Yeah, our source here is an article, Uganda Martyrs Were National Traitors. It's by Nnanda Kizito Sseruwagi, a Ugandan author. And it definitely offers a, let's say, striking reinterpretation.
It really does.
So our goal here, just to be clear, is to lay out the arguments from this specific article. We want to understand the context it provides and, why the author reaches this conclusion about traitors versus martyrs. We're not taking sides, just presenting the source's perspective.
Exactly. Get ready to look at a familiar story in maybe a completely new light.
So right out of the gate, the core argument, and it is controversial, is that these figures shouldn't really be called Uganda martyrs.
No, the author argues they should be seen as Uganda traitors.
Traitors. Why? What's the justification given?
Well, the reasoning presented is that these individuals were, according to the author, the very first nationals to actively undermine Uganda's sovereignty.
How so? By doing what?
By collaborating, the article claims, with foreign colonizing powers, essentially siding with outsiders against their own leadership.
And the article elaborates on that. How does it connect their faith to this idea of betrayal?
It argues they died for something called Christian civilization, which the author views as an ideology used to, well, justify colonialism.
So from this perspective, their defiance of their kings wasn't just religious conviction.
It was pledging allegiance to foreign conquerors. That's the argument. Defying local authority in favor of an incoming colonial power.
Wow. Okay. And the author sees echoes of this today.
Yes, the source contends that celebrating these figures without this context shows a kind of lack of national clarity in Uganda's history. It suggests that the ongoing, the author calls it, neo-colonial abuse of Uganda's sovereignty finds ideological support in the same mindset, glorifying those who, in this view, defied national authority for foreign influence.
So the narrative itself, the story of the martyrs, is framed as
Right.
a colonial coup.
Pretty much. The article calls it a colonial narrative that romanticizes betraying national authority for colonial rule. It stresses a need for ideological clarity to see past this and build Uganda's own historical account.
And failing to do that, according to the source.
Perpetuates what the author terms Western epistemic control over African history, basically letting the colonizers write the story.
The article also talks about the way Western conquest happened.
Yeah.
It wasn't always obvious, was it?
No, that's a key point. The source suggests it was often subtle, using narratives that seem harmless, like celebrating martyrs,
Right.
to actually gain intellectual control, shape thinking, and limit local political options. That subtlety was crucial for the initial takeover, the author claims.
Okay, let's get into the historical context the article uses to back this up. It mentions European explorers.
Yeah. Figures like Speke, Stanley, Livingstone, James Grant, we often hear them called explorers.
But the source says they weren't just mapping things.
No, the author argues they were essentially agents, preparing the ground for colonial conquest. The specific goal mentioned, controlling the Nile source.
Why the Nile?
To dominate Egypt and the Suez Canal, crucial for trade routes to India, it was strategic, not just geographical curiosity.
And Stanley's meeting with Kabaka Mutesa Itania in 1875.
The source claims Stanley misrepresented European intentions there, lied about what they were really after.
And this is interesting. The article challenges the common story that Mutesa asked for missionaries.
It does. It calls that idea a fabrication by colonial historians. Not something that actually happened, but a story created later to make the foreign influence seem invited or welcome.
Okay, so that sets a different stage. Now let's talk about the executions themselves.
Right.
Kabaka Mwanga II, 1885, 1887.
Right. The article stresses that these executions didn't happen in a vacuum. They occurred precisely when European powers were actively invading, dividing, and colonizing Africa. That's the crucial backdrop.
And the usual portrayal of Mwanga II is often quite negative, isn't it?
Very. Often painted as just a cruel pagan ruler. But the source argues that's a distortion.
So what's the alternative view of him and the converts?
The political reality, according to the author, was that the converts, the 22 Catholics and 23 Anglicans, were effectively national traitors.
Because they'd allied with foreign powers.
Yes, allied with colonizers during what the source describes as a religious struggle, but one that was fundamentally about political influence in Buganda.
Let's unpack that struggle. There were different religious groups involved.
Definitely. The article mentions Alexander Mackay, an Anglican, arriving in 1877, then French Catholic White Fathers, led by Père Simon Nordel in 1879, and Islam was already there through Arab traders.
So multiple groups competing for influence at the royal court.
Exactly. Competing for the king's ear, for power. And as they gained converts, especially in key positions,
The king's own authority started to slip.
that's the argument. Their intrigues and shifting allegiances weakened the traditional power structure.
So Mwanga II takes the throne in 1884.
Right into this growing storm of Christian influence and a court elite that was becoming increasingly westernized, pushing foreign agendas, according to the source.
And within a year, he orders executions. Yusufu Rugarama, Mako Kakumba, Noah Sarwanga.
Specifically for converting. And then Bishop Hannington, the Anglican bishop, in 1885. The source notes his prime minister encouraged that execution.
How does the author interpret these specific actions by Mwanga?
Not as random violence, but as deliberate warnings.
So to whom?
To the British, essentially saying, stop encroaching, stop interfering in our kingdom.
So Mwanga is framed less as a villain and more as a nationalist leader trying to defend his kingdom?
Precisely. A monarch trying to protect his sovereignty against these growing external and internal threats aligned with foreign powers.
Which brings us back to the main point. The conclusion is,
The source concludes that these figures, the so-called Uganda Martyrs, were, from this perspective, actually Uganda traitors, collaborators.
people who sided with colonial forces while their nation was being subjugated?
That's the core assertion.
And there's one more piece of evidence the article uses. Something about the Church Missionary Society.
Yeah, it points out that a few years after the executions, the English Church Missionary Society actively used the story of their deaths
Wow.
to rally support back in Britain for colonization. The author claims this confirms the political nature of it all.
That the British themselves saw and used these deaths politically.
Right, suggesting the converts were indeed seen as political actors allied with Britain, not just innocent religious victims.
Wow, okay. This really forces you to step back and think, doesn't it? What does digging into a perspective like this actually mean for you, the listener?
Yeah, how does it change how we understand the past? Or even the present?
And it highlights that crucial question. Who gets to tell the story? Whose version becomes the accepted history? And what might their reasons be?
It definitely pushes for a more critical look at the narratives we often just accept.
Exactly. So just to recap this deep dive into Nnanda Kizito Sseruwagi's article, it presents this challenging view
A very challenging view.
that the Uganda Martyrs could be interpreted through an anti-colonial lens focused on the political realities of the time as collaborators with encroaching European powers, rather than purely as heroes of faith.
And engaging with sources like this, even if they challenge our assumptions, is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. It helps you build a more complex, more critical understanding of history. You move beyond the simple stories.
It forces you to ask those deeper questions about context and motivation.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. When you have these historical moments, these clashes involving faith, national sovereignty, external ambitions, how do we even begin to untangle the true motivations of everyone involved? And, maybe more importantly, whose perspective ends up shaping the story that gets passed down through generations?